Hey, good morning. I hope you're having a wonderful day. Mine's great so far. I woke up in the camper a few miles back that way in Bernalillo, New Mexico. I'm in the San Juan Basin, and man, sunrise in the San Juan Basin, it just does not get a lot better than this, especially this time of year. Well, I'm going to be showing you guys some pretty exciting stuff today, I think. We're going to take a look at some of the geology of this really unique basin in northwestern New Mexico. And we're going to look at some of the sedimentology, obviously the stratigraphy, some of the clastics, but also a UFO crash site. There's a really interesting story to be told about UFOs, crash sites, and the oil and gas industry, especially here in New Mexico. But maybe, just maybe, there's also visitors from afar. I've been driving a little over 14 hours now, and I drove from southern Texas across the Colorado River up into the hill country of Texas. Saw some interesting artwork on some of the buildings. Ate healthy. Saw, of course, the classic Texas oil rigs. Saw, pretty much what you'd expect with the derricks, a lot of flare gas. It's kind of gross. And then, of course, finally made it to New Mexico. And New Mexico is famous for a lot of stuff, like chili peppers. It's famous for a lot of beautiful geology and scenery. But it's also famous for a weird number of UFO crashes. For some reason, there's a lot of UFOs that crash in the state. There's at least two, maybe a third that's been reported. There's been some landings. We're going to talk about some of this stuff on one of the crash sites. We're going to go up and take a look at Aztec. You've probably heard of Roswell. But we're going to go take a look at one called Aztec, especially because there's some pretty interesting geology. So I hope you stick around. I think you'll find it pretty exciting. I had a great time doing this. I think you will too. And back behind me here, you can see a little pump jack doing his business. Actually not doing his business. It's just kind of sitting stationary. But the San Juan Basin is a really gigantic, what's called a super basin, in that it's got huge volumes of gas, natural gas, a fair amount of oil, not as much as gas. It's got coal, it's got precious minerals. It's one of these basins that really has it all. But the San Juan Basin is one of these big depositional troughs between high mountain ranges out here in the Rockies. It's a Laramide basin, meaning it was part of the Western Interior Foreland Basin right up until the late Cretaceous. In the late Cretaceous, the foreland started to fragment as Laramide uplifts started to come up. And a Laramide uplift is essentially nothing more than a basement-involved uplift. In other words, the granite of the crust is involved with the uplift of the mountain range. So Laramide compression, which is because of compression from the west on the North American plate, started to fracture and fragment that basement along fault zones that were already there. Those fault zones had been there for hundreds of millions of years, possibly all the way back into, in some cases, the Precambrian suture zones. So Laramide uplift created these subbasins in the greater Western Interior Basin. And these subbasins, like the San Juan and the Denver Basin and the Powder River Basin, started filling in with sediment from the uplifts, because as they go up, the sediment starts eroding down. So the San Juan Basin is asymmetrical, and if you look at it in cross-section, from south to north, you'll see it's not just a simple bowl shape, it's a little bit skewed. So we'll talk more about that in a different video, but I just kind of wanted to introduce the idea of a Laramide basin. All right, first official geological stop of this tour. We're just a couple of miles past our first stop of the morning back at San Ysidro, and this cliff behind me with the moon sticking up over it, which is pretty spectacular in its own way. This is a really nice example of an unconformable succession. What I mean by that is the lower part of the cliff, that kind of reddish peach color material, is Triassic. That's the Chinle group. Triassic's one of my personal favorite times. I might have mentioned that in another video. But that's around 220, 230 million years old. And the upper cliff-forming sand, that belt that goes all the way across the cliff like that, that's the San Rafael group. That's a middle and late Jurassic unit. So it's maybe about 180, 190 billion years old. So we're somewhere between those two units missing maybe 10, 20, 30 million years of time, give or take. So we've got a Triassic basal unit, then a Jurassic upper part, and that Jurassic part is equivalent to the Sundance Formation in Wyoming. This includes the Entrada sandstone, which is a big aeolian deposit. It's windblown sand. And we're going to see a bunch more of that in the next few videos that are coming to you from Moab. The whole region was a giant sand sea in the Jurassic, so it looked a lot like Sahara. Very arid climate, very dry climate. Here, the aeolian deposits kind of interfingered with tidal and sabkha environments. So we had kind of a system where there's tidal flats, estuaries and bays and lagoons, along with these big dunes feeding into it. A situation not too dissimilar from what we see in the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea today. So a very similar environment. It was a very hostile marine system. And what I mean by hostile is very hypersaline, because there's so much evaporation, the salt gets really concentrated and the marine animals don't like it so much. Just a very important gap between them. And that's part of this regional system of unconformities that have been tracked all throughout the West, up into Wyoming, Montana, all the way down into southern New Mexico, across to Arizona, into Utah, Colorado. So these unconformities are probably related to tectonics. You had mountains going up and down, creating all sorts of angular relationships in these basins. We could spend all day talking about this stuff, but we got other things to look at. We got Paleocene rocks and a UFO crash site, so let's get to it. All right, we're getting closer. This is the Paleocene. This is the really, looks like a muddy, with some small channel bodies, succession of what's called the Nacimiento Formation. It's equivalent to the Ferris and the Hanna formations up in Wyoming. I've done a few videos on those. Up in Wyoming, there's a lot of coal, there's a lot of carbonaceous shale, there's tidal influence, there's estuarine channels, there's bayhead deltas. So up in Wyoming, a few hundred miles to the north, we're in a coastal plain environment, a lot like the modern Texas Gulf Coast. Here, we've got a lot of silts and sands of a floodplain. You see maybe some hints of darker color, but also a little bit of reds and maroons peeking out. That's indicative of soil formation. So we've probably got immature to moderately mature soils on an alluvial floodplain here. Nowhere close to the ocean. We're not really feeling any influence from that Cannonball Sea that's up to the north in Wyoming at this time. So the Nacimiento Formation is a big mammal fauna. There's a lot of Paleocene mammals from here that allows dating throughout the succession. Biostratigraphic dating essentially takes fossil zonations, correlates them to radioisotopic dates derived from things like potassium-argon dates and so on. And we find these recurring fossil assemblages always associated with a particular date. When you find it without any sort of radioisotopic data, you can still reasonably confidently say it's about the same age at point A as it is in point B. So correlation across these Rocky Mountain basins can be done with fossil mammals. You can use plants, you can use microvertebrates, you can use all kinds of things. We're going to continue north to look at some of the sandy facies of the Paleocene and the UFO site. Well, we made it. This is Hart Canyon Road behind me. This is the channely facies of the Nacimiento. We saw the mud-prone facies, now we're in the channely facies. We're going to continue up the road this way, because right up there on the ledge of this Nacimiento Formation, that is where in 1948, something crashed. If you're going to crash your flying saucer, this is a pretty picturesque place to do it, assuming you survive. So I gotta say, I'm not too surprised. There's nobody else out here. I'm all by myself. I don't think many people come out here. The road sucks. It really does. It's a terrible, terrible road. Dirt road, all chewed up. It's graded. So my teeth are still kind of vibrating. Just awful road. But we're taking the path out now to the crash site. There's not a lot of signs out here, but you can find it if you just kind of walk around. Interesting how this all came to be. Roswell had happened, July 4th or 5th of 1947. Something came down out of the sky. Everybody agrees something happened. Nobody agrees on what it actually was. Initially, it was reported by the Air Force. Well, it wasn't an Air Force back then. It was the Army. And they reported it as being a saucer. Headlines said that. News carried it out. Everybody recognized that it was a saucer. They didn't say debris. They didn't say mylar or anything like that. They said a saucer. A couple of days later, they realized, uh-oh, this is bad news. People are panicking. They released the information. It was actually a series of weather balloons, later identified as Project Mogul. The story about the bodies and the dummies came out many years later. So they went from being, yeah, it's a disc, to, well, it's wreckage of weather balloon. They buried it until the 70s when some interested parties dug out this information and started grubbing around. 8 months after Roswell, in March, on March 25th of 1948, Aztec happened. The story goes, in the pre-dawn hours, a bunch of people saw something flying through the sky at a very low angle, kind of bouncing off a couple of the bluffs and crashing down in this canyon over here. The first folks that got out to it were oil workers, because the oil fields have been here quite a long time. They reported something that's about 100 feet wide, silvery, disc shape. Sounds like a classic flying saucer, as they used to call them back in the day. Much later, the story of little bodies came out. And when I say much later, I mean about 2 years later. There was a fellow named Frank Scully, very X-Filesy. So Scully was interested in UFOs. He was a journalist. He got into contact with a fellow named Silas Newton. Silas was a really interesting character. Silas was a geophysicist. Nothing against geophysicists, a lot of them are really nice people. But Silas was a bit sketchy. He, dating back to the 30s, had a series of wire fraud schemes. The FBI was looking into him. There was lawsuits against him. Not really a guy you want to do business with. Silas's story is that he knew about the Aztec crash, knew people that were directly involved, and he himself was involved. He claimed he had wreckage, pieces of unidentified metal. This might be where the Roswell story came from, about these strange bits of metal or unidentified material you can't damage. Silas was there first, in 1950. What he claimed was actually alien metal, turned out to be aluminum. We know that because he hooked up not just with Scully, but with another fellow, Leonard Gebauer. So Leonard and Silas and Scully started running around, barnstorming the country, talking about their super duper knowledge of UFOs, flying saucers. They described the little bodies inside. And they described them as looking a lot like regular people, 3-4 feet tall, dressed in clothing similar to what you'd see in the American Midwest in the mid-1800s. All right, that's a little bit sketchy, but that was their story. They furthermore claimed that with the stolen technology or retrieved technology, they can incorporate into these little tools called doodle bugs, geophysical equipment that they could find oil, gold, coal, gas, you name it, their doodle bugs would do it. They actually fooled a bunch of investors, oil company guys from Denver. Got a lot of money from these characters. That's when the lawsuits started flying. These guys spent tens of thousands on Silas and Leonard's little gizmos. Now, Leonard was another interesting character. He was from Denver area. He was an electronics shop operator, so he had access to all kinds of electronical doohickeys. He could make things that seemed to work. He put together these little toys and gizmos, and him and Silas tried to make a bundle on it, and they did pretty good. Until the lawsuits happened. That's when they got in trouble. That shut it down, and by 1953, Silas and Leonard and Scully were out of it. But the story lives on. To this day, people swear a big craft came down. Now, there's been various explanations that it was a military fighter, some sort of prototype jet. We are in New Mexico. There's a lot of air bases around here. Roswell's not that far off, actually, if you're in a plane. There's some other bases around here, Socorro and whatnot. So it's possible some kind of prototype or accidental mishap with a jet fighter. There does seem to be some evidence that there was a retrieval out here, some sort of wreckage. What was it? To this day, nobody actually knows. So we're going to go to the site itself now and take a look around and see what we see. All right, we found it. I had to do some stumbling around because, like I say, there's not really any signs out here. You kind of have to feel it out. But we're on the big open flat spot where supposedly the craft was. Here, there's actually a little stone alien face that somebody's made. We'll see if we can get some shots of that. There is a little marker sign over here, so we'll take a look at that. But this plateau right here sits on one of those big channel bodies. This is supposedly where that 100-foot wide, 20-foot tall craft was. It was described variously as looking a lot like the thing from The Day the Earth Stood Still. Coincidence or not, you know, maybe people saw that movie and got inspired, or they recognized it. It's also been described as sort of almost looking like a hat with a raised rim and a central peak. That version of it actually made it into the X-Files. You'll see a part of one of their shows where it starts off with a crash landing of a UFO that's probably supposed to be Roswell, but it might be Aztec as well. But they did a pretty good job reproducing what it was described as by old Leonard. So who knows? Except they got the color wrong. They painted it kind of military green. So anyway, let's take a look-see what's happening over here. There's been a lot of pseudo-geology said about this site. Some UFO specialists, whatever that is, have claimed there's a lot of magnetite in the hills, and that's what screwed up the propulsion or navigation of the craft. Okay, who knows? So here's the sign. It talks about the recovery at Hart Canyon. Take a look at that. It's kind of interesting. On or about March 25th, 1948, blah, blah, blah. I'll include a still copy of this at the end so you can take a look at it yourself. You could probably find it online too. But this is the big open area. So this is supposedly where the craft came. I guess if you're gonna crash land a big saucer, this is as good a place as any. If you're trying to do it, you know, semi-controlled. Makes sense if it was a plane though too. You might be trying to do something similar. So it looks like people have made some kind of little, I don't know what that is. Almost looks like a butterfly or a Mothman. Maybe it's supposed to be Mothman. Could be Mothman. There's all sorts of little things people left behind. There's our friend over here. It's hard to see from the ground. It's like the Nazca lines. That's an upside down alien. I guess he's looking off poignantly into the sunset. And then there's something over here. Looks like a big starfish. Somebody's a fan of echinoderms. Hey, why not? You know, echinoderms are cool, freaky alien-like things. Sure, why not? A lot of traces from bicyclists. This is also a big mountain biking area. Oh, this is kind of cute. Somebody left a little this guy. Some sort of little Chimpokoman alien or something. So this is the site. There's obviously nothing left now. There's nothing to see, no wreckage. People have actually come out here and looked at the surrounding bluffs, tried to find bits of metal they could scrape, tried to find evidence of an impact. You know, you can find all kinds of things out here. There's a lot of oil equipment. There's a lot of derricks. There's a lot of trucks bouncing off of things. Oil workers, you know, on a Friday night, you're having a good night, bounce off a canyon wall. It can look like a UFO crashed and left a gouge in the canyon wall. So none of that's really convincing. The story about the little people that look just like little people in Midwestern attire, that's a little bit weird. There's a lot of circumstantial evidence that something came down, but there's no actual physical proof, and that's the problem. Like, if something 100 feet long had actually created a big gouge somewhere along here, this is sandstone. This is that channel sandstone. Would it have left a mark or not? You might expect to see something. Supposedly, somebody claimed these trees have been replanted by cleanup crews. They're growing in solid rock. I don't see how you can replant that, so I don't know about that. I'll chalk this one up to, I really think it's a cool story. The UFOs are really awesome. I think the whole story about UFOs in New Mexico and all that is really interesting. I think what's even more interesting is how geophysicists have turned into UFOologists back in the 50s and sold technology, quote unquote technology, to oil companies to make money and wound up being con men. If you work in an oil company or geothermal or carbon sequestration, or if you're an academic and somebody comes in, no matter what their qualifications, and starts talking about alien technology, UFOs, something a little bit weird, a doodle bug that can find whatever you want, maybe think twice, maybe ask for a demonstration. There's a lot of weird stuff going on now with AI. People are using machine learning. My personal feeling is a lot of that is maybe just a little bit doodle buggish, and you maybe want to ask for definite proof of concept before you spend lots and lots of money like the poor guys in the 50s. Then you have to go chasing after your version of a Silas and a Leonard. Something to think about. So this has been our kind of whirlwind tour of the San Juan Basin, the UFO crash site in the San Juan Basin, the implications of the geology, ufology, and economics on how you might do geology, how you might look at these rocks, and just how you look at your surroundings in general. It's a big world. There's a lot of really cool stuff out there. Thank you so much for watching. Next stop, Moab. I'll see you there.